For nearly 30 years, the Borromeo String Quartet has captivated audiences with their engaging, cohesive, and passionate playing. I'm joined now by founding member and first violinist Nicholas Kitchen, ahead of Borromeo's performance tomorrow evening. Good afternoon, Nicholas.
Good afternoon.
It really is a pleasure to have you here in Winnipeg. Thanks so much for coming by the studio.
My pleasure.
Well, so I want to just begin by saying that it was in 1989, right, at the Curtis Institute, that the Borromeo String Quartet came together. Most ensembles don't have that kind of longevity.
Yeah, I guess it's funny, you know, the truth is that it feels like it was yesterday.
Really?
But yes, you realize after a while that quite a few winters and summers have passed with you playing quartets during them.
It's not a bad way to spend a winter and a summer.
Indeed.
What do you think has kept you guys together for so long?
Well, you know, the string quartet literature, people do say how great it is, but there's no way they can say it that's not an understatement of the truth. It embodies a kind of conversation, and yet is a texture that can create grandeur like almost nothing else. So we have everything from the most intimate kind of funny conversations between people to these epic kind of statements in music. And for whatever reason, that capacity has fascinated people like Beethoven and people like Schoenberg and people like Bartók and people like Mozart, so that they've just poured their souls and their imagination and their fantasy into this medium, and all we have to do is just open the door. And frankly, once you start opening one of those doors, there's 1,000 more doors behind them, and none of them are any less rich than the other one. And before you know it, 30 years are over. So
before we start opening some of those doors, or at least knocking here in the Diamond Lane, I just need to ask, the name, Borromeo, the only thing I could find was it being a preeminent surname of like the 16th, 17th century. Where does the name come from?
The original group, the second violinist of the group was Ruggero Alifranchini. He and I were both students of Szymon Goldberg at Curtis. And actually, Mr. Goldberg was talking about summer festivals, and he said, well, you know, summer festivals are wonderful, but you don't have to do a festival. You could create your own project. And so Ruggero and I kind of started talking about this, and Ruggero's father was very involved in a lot of teaching and education in northern Italy. He's a jazz musician, actually. But and Ruggero said, well, what if we arrange a set of small concerts in the north of Italy near my house, near his house, and we'll stay at my family's home, and then we'll go out and do the concerts. And that's exactly what we did. We somewhere in July or something like that, we were staying with Ruggero's fantastically generous parents and his mother, who literally is one of the best cooks I've ever witnessed in my life. And we were rehearsing, and we did about 10 concerts in all these hill towns in northern Italy. And one of the very first ones of those was next to the Borromeo Islands.
Wow.
And the Borromeo Islands are out in the middle of Lago Maggiore, and literally you're on the town of Stresa, and you look out and you see the Alps behind, and you see these sculpture gardens come out of the water and these palaces. It is absolutely fantastical. And when we came home and we thought, wow, that went pretty well, we decided to sort of stick with it. And Isan, the cellist, said, well, we were trying to think of a name, and she said, well, what about those islands that we visited? Because we visited those islands, I think, the day after our first concert. And at that moment, we became the Borromeo Quartet.
Oh, man, what an outstanding story. It really paints, I was trying to piece it together, and that's one of the stories you really just have to ask about. You mentioned how the ensembles maybe changed, the original second violinist. How do you think, as an ensemble, you've grown over the course of those 30 years, nearly 30 years?
Yeah, well, it's it is exciting that you do your very, very best at each day and each week, but then you do realize that you can continue to improve. And we really love the fact that we do seem to get more and more comfortable getting at the substance of this music, which is, of course, that's a rhetorical challenge to understand what are you trying to bring across as an experience, but it's also a technical challenge. It's a physical complexity to what we're trying to achieve in real time on the stage. Yes, I think it's been interesting at those moments. And a string quartet is an intense experience, and there's a certain moment when a member knows, I've loved this and I've had a great time, but it's time to make a little bit of a change. And we've had that happen a few times. And of course, it's challenging when a new member joins in, but this is the two sides of the coin, that the challenge comes at you, but then actually it brings out new things in your own learning to rebuild things over and over and over again.
It continues to grow and it continues to evolve.
Yeah.
It is a living thing that way, which we keep coming back to in these interviews that I get to have with some outstanding musicians like yourself. So tomorrow, the program with Virtuosi Concert Series features Bach, Mendelssohn, Clavier, and Beethoven.
Yep.
And I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the thread that weaves through this is the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, I think, in a way.
Yes.
And I want to begin with the Bach. You're performing the Well-Tempered Clavier without the clavier. There's no keyboard, right? And I'm just wondering, this is an arrangement done by yourself.
That's right.
What inspired you to undertake such a project?
Well, very literally, I think it may have been 15 years ago, there's a fantastic musicologist, Louis Lockwood, and we gave a program, which was a huge program, of Opus 132 and Opus 131 and Opus 130 with the Grosse Fugue. And I was involved in the arrangement of that program, and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to have Louis Lockwood give a lecture before that as a separate event to prepare the audience? And he was willing, and we were willing to participate. And in that, he explained how at this moment, at the end of Beethoven's life, he even started writing out the Well-Tempered Clavier in quartet score.
Wow.
Actually, the B minor fugue, the very last in Book 1. And he did, in fact, arrange the B-flat minor fugue for cello quintet. And what you find is that Beethoven had mastered the Well-Tempered Clavier, both books, by the time he was 12. And that wasn't just something that started then and then went away. In fact, it seems like its significance grew. And at the end of his life, he was creating these fantastic, giant, monumental fugues, which were somehow his response and his development of what he had been doing since he was a child. And Louis Lockwood had us play some of the Well-Tempered Clavier. And so that was about 15 years ago. And at that moment, I said, this really is something beautiful to hear these lines done by 4 singers or 4 players. And so I thought I really should revisit this. And it wasn't maybe until 15 years later that I weirdly was stuck with being in traffic for 2 hours a day in Beijing. And I said, well, I've always intended to do that. Why don't I start doing it right now? Wow. And then I started, and then the CD that we're looking at of all 48 pieces of Book 1 is what resulted from that.
What changes when you go from I mean, obviously the instruments change and the tone and the temperament that way change, but do you miss out on something when you move from the keyboard to the string quartet, or is something new added? How does it change in your mind what Bach originally wrote? Well,
for most people that hear and have loved this music or played it themselves, they've heard it on a piano,
of course,
or they may have heard it on a harpsichord. There really is not much question that when he said clavier, he was not just talking about, he was talking about anything which could be played that way. And of course that includes the organ and the clavichord, which Bach was so famous for the way he would move listeners by the way he played the clavichord, and particularly his ability to make the clavichord sing. I mean, I remember reading a report where a singer was standing beside Bach as he sang on the clavichord and was embarrassed because basically they were contemplating that he was achieving a more singing line than they could with their voice. So when you put this in perspective, we have a lot of ways we hear Bach. Sometimes it sounds kind of mechanical. Sometimes it can have a lot of different sounds. And frankly, they're all great. They're all fascinating. But I do think you don't even have to look far to hear Bach talk about the need to sing on the keyboard. Those are some of the few words he actually wrote about what someone needs to study. And so to me, it's very, very natural to take the inflected line that a string player can bring, the shading, the cantabile. Of course, many of the fugues are not cantabile at all, but they have a fantastic vitality to the way the voices sing against each other. And this, well, we have loved the way that works in the string quartet. And fortunately, other people seem to enjoy it too.
Of course, the way they're so melodically driven, and that idea of a singularity in the line, be it the line of your fingers or each string part then having their own line that way. With that, looking at the rest of the program, I mean, I mentioned some of the other composers. Mendelssohn, of course, ties in wonderfully. He called Bach his daily bread or something like that?
Well, Schumann has a famous quote where he says, Schumann said it was his daily bread. But I think Mendelssohn, it was his daily water, perhaps.
And he was responsible for the revitalization of Bach in a way as well.
And his whole family, were all deeply tied into the Sing Academy and all of these parts of Bach's history, which he couldn't have been more deeply affected by the content of Bach's music. And he and Fanny, his sister, would play sections of the Well-Tempered Clavier for each other. Of course, what happens in this concert is you will hear the quartet, Opus 13, that Mendelssohn wrote when he was 18, or he completed it when he was 18. And I've pointed out that when you're in the middle of the second movement, you are going to hear a grand, large fugue. And this fugue is highly expressive. Now, all this is really interesting because it points to the fugue that Beethoven wrote in the C-sharp minor quartet that is also fantastically expressive, very, in a sense, dark. But what one has to contemplate is that here, where Beethoven was 18, where Mendelssohn was 18 in 1827, that he had absorbed this musical language of Beethoven that had just been written a couple of years before. Now, when you combine that with the way he had studied Bach, you see, in a sense, it was almost like they were both drinking at the same trough.
Yeah, absolutely. With that, can we move to the Beethoven, the Lieb Quartet that you're going to be performing? What can you tell audiences about that work, the String Quartet number 13 in B-flat major?
Well, people sometimes throw around the words the sublime and the ridiculous, and I don't really want to say that about that work, except I think there's something positive in saying that about that work, because in all the late quartets, Beethoven had this uncanny way of creating expressive music which just couldn't have a deeper spirituality or more of a sense that it's expressing something that very few musicians have been able to express about what it is to be human. Yeah. But what's so wonderful, and maybe sometimes gets a little underplayed because we take it naturally so seriously, is that Beethoven had a wild sense of humor. Czerny said that there was no occasion that Beethoven did not have a pun for. Now, you can imagine that might be a little annoying. But I'm sure they were very clever. And actually, what I think is so wonderful about the B-flat quartet is that it lives both of these sides of Beethoven to their maximum. He takes this sort of wild humor, and if one hears the Grosse Fugue with this wild, imaginative humor behind it, it is such a joyous expression of humanity. And then back up, that's the last movement, the huge movement with which it will end. Back up to the cavatina, and we have something that is just so tender and so humble in the way it expresses these inner feelings. And then as you back up again, and we have the Tedesca movement, which is this gently dancing, teasing thing, which has all these games of 2 and 3. And then back up one more movement, and we have the actual scherzoso movement, the third movement. And what you're seeing again and again is that these movements are exploring motion and gesture and humor, frankly, in a way that is very similar to a Baroque dance suite. They take a character and ride that character
and
wherever.
them in a way.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the second movement's only 2 minutes long, but it is absolutely brilliant, and again, tremendously funny. And the first movement, of course, has everything. It has these sort of virtuoso running around, literally like kids running around a swimming pool almost. And then all of a sudden it will be in this world of these sort of searching melodies, which are so touching and so tender, again, just like the cavatina.
So very briefly, as we are running a little bit tight on time, and if you're just tuning in, I'm chatting with Nicholas Kitchen of the Borromeo String Quartet. I want to ask you about the Sebastian Courier. Just very briefly, for audience members, admittedly, I'm not super familiar with his music. What can you tell us about Sebastian Courier?
Well, he's from a family of composers, which is wonderful, and we've worked with him, of course, and gotten to know him.
He is
modern,
around, he is living, and he is composing.
And he, the two pieces you're going to hear actually connect very beautifully with some of the characters we were just talking about in the Beethoven. The first movement, the Etude, is, well, for one thing, it's a display piece. You will see us play incredibly fast for incredibly long in just all sorts of wild ways.
It's always nice to marvel at virtuosity.
Well,
you know?
it is. And it's a joyful virtuosity. It actually, you'll hear the bass lines are a lot like what these sort of stride pianists will do with these super fast bass lines. So it has a little bit of that jazz sound to it, and very, very fun. And then we go into the Lullaby, and the Lullaby is almost boiling. It's like a painting that has one brush stroke on it. It's just taken the music down to its quietest and its most simple, and again, it's supposed to be like, I think it's somehow like a dreaming vision. Totally. And very, very beautiful. Very beautiful.
I want to thank you so much for coming by the studio this afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you here. You can see Nicholas Kitchen performing with the Borromeo String Quartet tomorrow. That is Saturday, February 10th. It is part of the Virtuosi Concert Series. And the show begins at 7:30 p.m. For more information, you can go to virtuosi.mb.ca or head to classic107.com. Nicholas Kitchen, thanks for coming by the studio.
My pleasure.
We're going to end this interview with some of your transcriptions of the Well-Tempered Clavier.
Wonderful.
I was wondering if you could set up for us the Prelude in E flat major, the Prelude and Fugue, just before we give it a listen.
Yeah, this is a kind of organ texture that one hears in many works around that time, like even Pachelbel and Bohm that Bach himself loved so much. And it's very quick exchanges. All the voices are kind of like rolling on top of each other with a kind of rich, quick dialogue, but all of it adds up to this kind of edifice of richness in this very regal key of E-flat major.
Wonderful. Well, as I just accidentally pressed there, we are going to hear just that performed by the Borromeo Quartet.